For this session, we have three speakers, the Minister of Electricity, Dr. Ramokgopa, the CEO of OneWorld, Ms. Belynda Petrie, and the Executive Officer of Green Scooter, Mr. Fezile Dhlamini. Welcome to our speakers. All right, the topic for this session would be a whole of society approach to inclusive just transition. And my first question I would like to pose to the Minister. Minister, reducing greenhouse gas emission is in line with the government's goal to transition South Africa towards a low carbon economy. And this economy must be resilient, and a resilient economy as well. And we're looking at a target of 2020 that was outlined in the Just Transition Framework for South Africa, championed by the Presidential Climate Change Commission and endorsed by the Cabinet last year, August 2022 rather. So my question there, sir, is, as the Minister of Electricity, how are you engaging with Eskom Just Transition Project team to ensure that the PPC's Just Transition Framework are implemented? Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitations, and good morning to fellow panelists and everyone on the call. Maybe just to make the point that after the introduction or the inception of the ministry, I had to undertake extensive studies, visiting each and every power station, trying to understand, one, the magnitude of the problem, the profile and the configuration of the problem, with a view of providing a solution on how best to attend to the problem. Remember that the assignment is meant to resolve two main problems. So the first one is to address the challenges related to load shedding. So in the short term, you reduce the intensity of load shedding, reduce the frequency of load shedding, and medium term, we get to a stage where we eliminate the load shedding unmet demand, and then begin an effort to create energy resilience, ensure that there's sufficient capacity installed to support, if you like, the growth that we aspire for in the country. So that's the primary mandate, really. And part of what we got to present before Cabinet was that there has to be a significant rethink and a recalibration of some of the commitment in relation to the timelines or the cadence of decarbonization. So outside the technical consideration, the first issue there, which was in part raised by some of your panelists in the earlier panel, is the democratization of the conversation, because I think this should not be an exclusive domain of the enlightened, the educated, and the elite. I think what needs to happen is that we must broaden the flow of participation by local communities. And when I visited some of these power stations, which were meant to be decommissioned, one of them has already been decommissioned. You find that the very strong voice of communities and also key stakeholders in the form of workers, organized workers, just not understanding what are these commitments, and their translation on the ground has been, in some instances, utter devastation of the socio-economic interest of those communities. And then the second one is the issue around the issues of access, which were raised earlier on. So essentially talking to the fact that we don't have universal penetration as I speak to you. So there's about 7% of households that don't have access to electricity. So part of the conversation should be about ensuring that we achieve universal access by expanding grid access and or borrowing on recent technologies that makes possible for microgrids. And we know that we're also transitioning into a distributed grid system. And then the second part in relation to, or the third area, it's about the availability, which is what I'm addressing. So you might be connected to the grid, but you don't have the energy is not available all the time. As I speak to you now, I'm load shed, so I'm connected to the grid, but the energy is not available because generation can't meet demand. And then the last area is about the affordability, and this speaks to the need for us to consider how best to exploit our resources to ensure that we achieve a least cost offering to communities, make it possible for us to ensure that we are able to achieve universal access in a manner that makes it possible for us to exploit our endowments. So that's the totality of the issues that were confronting us. And as a result of that, one of the issues that we presented before Cabinet and were able to prevail was the delayed decommissioning of some of these units. And that doesn't detract or subtract from our commitment to a decarbonization agenda. It's just an admission that the local conditions requires that there has to be a rethink on how you are going to manage the transition. So you are not going to transition into darkness, but you must transition whilst the lights are on. I think it's an important part. So it's not a deviation from that agenda. And ensuring that to take everyone on board. So the conversation must be broadened. I think it can benefit immensely from the multiplicity of voices. So there must not be a one-dimensional view, because I think part of the problem in the discourse is that we're presented with a binary choice. So on the one extreme is those who argue that you need to decarbonize at all costs, even if it means undermining, trampling upon, if you like, the developmental objectives of the country and the issues, like I mentioned, of universal access. And then on the other extreme polar opposite of the continuum is those who still insist that we must just rely on the super exploitation of our endowments at all costs without any consideration of harm to the environment, the ecological equilibrium. And I think that there has to be a mediation of that. And that mediation is such that there's an opportunity to have all of these fuel sources as part of a mix that is going to help us to achieve the things that I've mentioned about. So I think the amount of hostility that exists is undesirable and unhelpful. And of course, it's very toxic in the environment, especially when we are faced with such a mammoth task that is facing the country. But the long and short to your answer is that there's a rethink on the cadence of the decarbonization agenda, essentially taking into account all the elements that are present, that obtain in our own conditions, to ensure that as we decarbonize, we are not undermining our developmental objectives. We're not causing any harm or injury to the South African economy. As I speak to you, there's a number of people who are out of employment as a result of load shedding. There's considerable harm to the country's GDP. So we need to ensure that we account for everything. And that's why we were able to advocate for a delayed decommissioning, whilst still reaffirming our stance in relation to the net zero path as we articulate in government documents. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Minister. Ms. Belynda, if I can then bring you in from an investment perspective, how does OneWorld sustainable investment define the concept of just transition in the context of sustainable development with specific initiative, or rather what specific initiatives or projects or even sectors has OneWorld undertaken to support and through this inclusive just transition and sustainability?
Thank you. Thank you, Dhlamini. And yeah, good morning, everybody. It's great to be on this platform. I've appreciated the previous speakers' inputs, and I'll comment on those as well. From OneWorld's perspective, we've been fortunate in being able to have worked in the just transition space in South Africa and also elsewhere probably since 2017, when we started working with the National Planning Commission on the just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient society, and then more recently with the Presidential Climate Commission that's taken that baton over. But our overall program of work, which encompasses a focus on natural resources and making those resilient, sustainable finance, just transitions, and climate resilience. Climate resilience and sustainable development sit at the nexus of those themes of our work. And for us, the just transition embodies the sustainable development goals and vice versa. And I think that connection needs to be made stronger and stronger as all of us continue with our various programs of work. And what I mean by that, that embodiment in the SDGs is that the just transition is about building and managing a low carbon and more resilient future that is sustainable. It's about managing the economic, social, and environmental challenges that go with that. And it's about doing that through promoting a more inclusive and equitable society, which all of the speakers have spoken about. And the SDGs sit at the heart of that. And, I think an interpretation of the SDGs will show you that it is necessary to protect workers and communities that are dependent on carbon-intensive industries in the transformation. The SDGs embody what the Minister has just said, is that we need universal access. We can't be leaving people in the dark. We need a just shift towards sustainability that's accompanied by fair and equitable policies and measures. Those include for social inclusion, which consider the voices meaningfully of workers and communities that are reliant on those carbon-intensive, high-emitting industries, for example. We need to consider workers' rights and retraining and facilitate their transition into green sectors. We need to provide support to communities that may suffer hardship in the transition, and those would, I suppose, entail the principles of justice that the Presidential Climate Commission applies. Equity and justice has to be applied. We need to consider, I think, first and foremost, the fair distribution of transition benefits and costs. And the only way that one can manage for that and do that effectively and coherently is through some collaboration and dialogue with all the social partners and to plan and implement effectively. This can't happen in a vacuum. It can't happen on its own. It needs to be a considered process. And that, I think, entrenches, that approach is entrenched in OneWorld's approach. Just in terms of some examples of what I'm talking about, you asked about what sectors and initiatives we're involved in, Dhlamini. These are, the just transition and sustainable development issues are cross-cutting, and they've got a far and wide reach. And so our work in the globe is primarily in the global south, but it is with national and international as well as regional clients. So sometimes there's opportunity for South-South learning, for South-North dialogue. And, what something Crispian said earlier that really resonated for me. And the work that we do is that we can't be sitting around replicating and making slight adjustments to Northern agendas. We need to be crafting our own agenda, but within the broader principles of the just transition. So in this, we consider at OneWorld through all of our work, which ranges across all spectrums of, at the moment, we're doing green hydrogen, finance landscape and accelerator analysis. South Africa within the international green hydrogen space and so-called value chains. We do a lot of work in facilitating climate finance access and developing resource mobilization strategies, and we try very hard to work towards incorporating just transition approaches and the sustainable development goals and principles in that work. So, for example, that can range from smallholder farmers, broader food security issues, water sector resilience, which we're doing a resource mobilization strategy for at the moment for SADC in the Southern African region. Child protection in the climate, energy and environment transition is work we've been doing for UNICEF across Africa and Asia in the last few years. And it is an incredible consideration to think about the child in this context of the just transition, and where do child rights sit as we make these kinds of global and national transitions. So that's been an enormous focus. At the moment, we're also busy developing a climate change response strategy and investment plan for human settlements in South Africa. And this is right off the back of the horrifying KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga floods that happened recently, and that we are still trying to measure the costs and the shock of, with some difficulty. Climate resilience is as important for us a focus as it is on reducing emissions in terms of our global targets. And our work very much considers how one builds climate resilience in important sectors like agriculture, the built environment, water, etc., that people buy into. And when I say people, I mean all of society, and that was the title of your seminar today. And then with that in mind, we are also developing scenarios for achieving South Africa's 2050 sector emission targets with the Department of Environmental Affairs and other partners. And that covers various sectors, including energy and transport, among others. And then I'm very happy to say that we're also currently developing some international case studies on the just transition, including from South Africa, but also other countries such as Indonesia.
Thank you so much, Belynda. To bring Mr. Fezile into the conversation, sir, you are exiting South Africa to Germany. Funding. Just share some insight on that, just focusing on the barriers and challenges that you have experienced as a small business owner participating in this just transition.
Yeah, morning, Dhlamini, and my learned colleagues and everyone else that's in the session. So yes, I mean, we've been around for about 7 years now. Literally building electric vehicles, which we were hoping would serve a purpose within society overall, but obviously more so from a manufacturing perspective, helping to transition the skills side of things, moving from, your traditional mechanical skills to more electrified and understanding the know-how of building and curating different transport options. And this happened because for several years of knocking on government doors and private doors, you eventually get to pick up and realize that South Africa is not a country that is conducive for manufacturing, especially that of something which is new. What South Africa is great at, however, is taking what is given to it by the West or by the Chinese and, adopting it within society. So with all of that taking place, and having traveled abroad, we realized that we'll burn all the capital that we have trying to create this tomorrow that South Africa or Africa deserves, which is to strongly participate within the automotive sector. We had thought that having read all these policies that our government has, such your GTS 2050, your green papers, your NDP 2030. There's all these documentation that we thought we had met and we would get the support to build. We realized that it's never going to happen. And that is because of one key critical thing, which is access to finance. So access to finance is a big problem for SMEs within South Africa. And it seems like there's a huge disconnect between those who are within the DFI space, those within the private capital banking space, and those that are asking for it. We find ourselves in a position in society where the youth are actually worse off being in South Africa, especially highly skilled youth. They're worse off because the structures that are there that have been created are not there to support them. They're there to actually, how do you call it? You put up to pacify them, and it pacifies them in such a way that it becomes very frustrating. Trying to build a company for 7 years, which is an automotive company, even as a company where we've established ourselves based on merit. I had to even at some point find myself going and starting another company, which was a cash cow to fund my main company, which was Green Scooter. And even if you go through all of those things and trying to introduce green technology, clean energy, and you're trying to build this whole value chain, you're trying to create this whole new ecosystem that we deserve, it is still not going to be possible even if you're Black and even if you're young. It just doesn't work because there's a huge disconnect between those who are making policies and those who are trying to implement them. So with us now leaving the country, we're leaving it because the opportunities are much more easier to access abroad. You have more access to R&D financing. We've been building another product for a couple of months, and we thought that this would be the game changer, where the value chain, right from your batteries, your motor controllers, your powertrains, etc. As we localize all of those components, which there's a certain responsibility within the automotive space, we thought that would work. And again, that was another thing that was a pushback. So small businesses, youth, automotive sector, renewable energies are unfortunately not going to have any young people participating in it because of exactly that non-proactive public policy making. One, two, having a financing model that is so traditional that, where do we expect a historically disadvantaged individual to have 50 million or 100 million for energy transition project, right? And then let's say, let me give an example of like your Black industrial scheme, which again, if we were trying to manufacture batteries, or we're trying to manufacture any other renewable component, it will still not be possible because as much as you've got your Black industrial scheme, which is, they give you up to a 50% incentive, a grant for a project, which is up to 50 million, you still have to now try and find an additional co-funder for that project. And now it becomes the whole chicken and the egg situation. Hence why it's so much easier for this entire transition conversation to happen where there's people with money actually managing it, and not people that don't have any of that, even though they have the right ideas, they have the right skill sets. I hope I've given a wide scope of that particular thing.
Thank you so much, Fezile. Minister, if we can bring you in here, what is the government doing to keep people like Fezile in the country? I say this asking what initiatives have been undertaken to influence legislation and regulations to provide incentive programs like Fezile is saying, to stimulate all relevant stakeholders in the energy mix, right? Especially for SMME support, because it sounds to me like if we don't promote participation and innovation from the youth, we will just perpetuate the consumer-centric culture that Fezile just mentioned.
Well, first, just to congratulate Fezile for his resilience and the kind of industry that he has demonstrated. I think there's young people like Fezile should be celebrated. I think they represent a cohort of young people who are going to help to develop the country in significant ways. But it's also regrettable in the same vein, just to note that he has taken a very painful decision out of the frustrations, as he has articulated, of him not being able to get the kind of assistance that I would have thought the government should be providing ordinarily to entrepreneurs like Fezile. And of course, he did allude to some of the programs that are there in government. And I think the point he's making is that those programs are not particularly helpful to support the kind of startups that he represents. This thing called skin in the game, it's a conversation we're having in government for exactly the same reasons that he has articulated, that they are not sitting on some big pool of liquidity that they can access easily. So it's important that the developmental institutions should play that role. And that's why we are advocating for the recapitalization of the GFIs to make it possible for people like Fezile to be able to realize their dreams, but also to help the country to industrialize. Let me just make a bigger point. I've noted Fezile's point, and I'll take it up with him offline. And I'm going to the IDC coincidentally after this conversation to have almost a similar discussion around the need for us to industrialize on the back of the opportunities that we have identified in the greening of energy generation in the country. I mean, as I speak to you, there's a pipeline of about 66 gigawatts of projects, the combination of PV and wind that is sitting with the private sector players. It's a healthy pipeline of projects. Some of them are very close to financial close, so they'll be realized that they are going to get into construction. And the point that we're making is that there's a need for us to exploit that opportunity and ensure that we're able to localize the manufacturing of those components, the PV panels, the batteries, the inverters. Of course, you need considerable scale to justify the scale of investment that is associated with such a move. When I visited China recently, and when I met my counterpart, they were sharing with me that when they started the program, that is universally hailed as one of the most successful programs in relation to a feed-in tariff, essentially extending an incentive to households and industries to install rooftop solar solution, and for those households and industries to feed into the grid any excess generation capacity that is derived from the installation of PV solar. And essentially you are reconfiguring households to move from net consumers to net generators of energy, and in that way they're able to earn an annuity for themselves going into the future. And he makes the point that when they started this initiative, Vietnam was a net importer of PV panels, and over a period of about 3 years, they are now a net exporter of PV panels. And he makes the point that over a period of 12 months, they've been able to install 8 gigawatts of energy into the grid derived from a PV solar. And I got to visit the plant that is manufacturing this PV, the most technologically advanced in the region, and I think arguably in the world. And it's native Vietnamese, indigenous people there, people like Fezile. That government was very aggressive and deliberate in supporting them because they could see that there's a demand. The government also generated the demand, of course, through a set of incentives that they had introduced, and galvanized the whole of society to look into buying solar panels. And then on the back of that, they were able to industrialize. We can see the see-through also. I just said that there's 66 gigawatts, but I think we must just see it beyond just the domestic market. I think in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, I think the opportunities are vast. And the point I make all the time when I meet the entrepreneurs was to say, look at these opportunities beyond just South Africa, the domestic market, but beyond. But it starts with us from a policy articulation point of view, but also from the financing instruments that we introduce. to back up, if you like, our claim to say that we want to industrialize. So it's highly regrettable that someone as talented as Fezile and his colleagues are deciding to leave the country of their birth. And you can see it's extremely painful because their own government is not supporting those initiatives. But at least on the area where I am, on the electricity part, how we see the transition happening. And this speaks to the point I made earlier on, that as we transition, so the conversation should not be predisposed just on what are the ecological and climate, if you like, implications of not transitioning, but it must also speak to the socioeconomic impact of this conversation. It must be a balanced conversation. So there mustn't just be a barrage of what it means to the environment. Yes, we do understand we have got an obligation, but it's also to ensure that people like Fezile, as they industrialize, they are able to build scale. And then you are able to retrain people who might be retrenched from your coal-fired power stations to go and be employed where Fezile is at, so that the net employment impact is positive. And that's the point that I'm referring to. And we know that there are regions in the country that are extremely devastated, or they are vulnerable to this negative impact, especially in areas there's a significant density of this power station in Mpumalanga. There's catastrophic devastation to those communities. So the conversation has to be balanced. So you don't just put forward a need to decarbonize. First is understanding what these implications are and what tools in the form of policy incentives that we get to introduce to ensure that we undermine any negative impact whilst we reaffirm our stance on the need to decarbonize, because we've got an appreciation, science has proven it, with regards to emissions and therefore climate change. And we can see the devastation is causing to many communities, especially poor areas. So that's beyond the question. So it's how the cadence and also how you configure that intervention. And I think Fezile is a classic example of state failure to support that agenda. And I think it's something that should be corrected. Like I said, we'll attempt to engage with him. But I think there's a bigger conversation just outside Fezile of young people, talented entrepreneurs who are seeing these opportunities, but the policy environment is not supporting them. Or there could be a policy articulation, but it's not necessarily adequate to make sure that they succeed in their ventures. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. If I can pull you in, Ms. Belynda, on a parting shot from you, if you may share some insight on some risks and opportunities that you see in the automotive industry. I say this on the back of a comment you made last year, citing the decline in the export of the cars that we manufacture here. So based on that, focusing on the impact they will have on transition, these risks and opportunities, as well as what are the current investment strategies, trends, and are they comparable to our global counterparts?
Thank you, Dhlamini. Yeah, I think I spoke last year about the potential of decline rather than an absolute decline. So I'll pick up a little bit more on that conversation, as the Minister has just said, around we need to have a balanced conversation. And I think what's facing the automotive industry in this country needs that. We need to balance the challenges that we do face in that industry with the transition, or that are associated with the transition, with the opportunities that are also significant in the sector. And again, want to echo something I think various speakers, including Crispy and myself, have said today, and that is that we need effective and coherent planning. This needs thought. It's not going to happen on its own. But just to talk a little bit more in terms of the detail around those points, let me start with some numbers. So in terms of the automotive industry, employment and workforce, which is considerable, there are around, and these numbers that I'm going to give you now vary between 2018 and 2020 are the most recent. So there could be changes, but we have 110,000 direct jobs in the industry. There are 112,000 component to vehicle assembly jobs that have a strong multiplier effect into an estimate of 320,000 jobs. From an investment perspective, in 2020, the 7 big assemblers, by which I'm referring to the Toyotas, Mercedes-Benz, etc., those big assemblers invested 9.2 billion South African rand into the industry, and the component manufacturers that support the big assemblers invested 2.4 billion South African rand into the industry. And colleagues, with those numbers for jobs and investment that I've given you now, that requires a high level of skill in the sector, which exists at the moment. So that's also something that one needs to consider, in the transition, and something I said earlier around retraining and facilitating people's transition. And then there are challenges and opportunities in other aspects that affect the sector, such as investment and innovation. And this has been one of the big debates that's been going on in South Africa around electric vehicles, for example, is whether or not we could have the capacity and the skills and the competitive advantage compared to other countries that have already moved into the space to manufacture the battery packs that are needed for electric vehicles. And if we didn't manufacture those battery packs, what would happen to all those component to vehicle assembly jobs that I spoke about just now, which was a significant number, for example. There's also green hydrogen, which has gained traction in the South Africa's imagination recently. And this issue that I raise around competitiveness is a theme that I'll come back to. There are also challenges and opportunity in terms of infrastructure development and supply chain. And so, for example, we need charging networks for electric vehicles, and we would need green hydrogen filling stations, for example, if we went the green hydrogen route for transport. The environmental benefits are a no-brainer, really, in terms of both reduced emissions, but also in terms of improved human health. And the number of legal cases and diseases and deaths that are associated, including for South Africa's children, with air that is not clean, is significant. So we need to also look comprehensively at the environmental benefits and what does this mean for South Africa in a South African agenda. The market and consumer behavior change is an interesting one, and I'm going to come back to that just now, because what I said last year, Dhlamini, was around the potential displacement of imports from South Africa by Europe for vehicles, because a good chunk of what we produce in the country goes into the export market, and we've got a heavy reliance on that to keep the industry alive. And European targets for green transport are significant and are shifting market and consumer behavior, but that's also starting to happen here. So, for example, this year, the first quarter of 2023, this country sold 232 electric vehicles, by which I mean a combination of hybrid electric vehicles, pure electric vehicles, etc. But the 232 vehicles that we sold in quarter one in this country in this year is equivalent to half of all the electric vehicles that we sold in 2022 in South Africa. So the demand, it takes me back to this point of market and consumer behavior. The demand is even starting to shift in our own country. But then, of course, the big question is, do we have the infrastructure, etc., and the policy and regulatory environment to support that? So my response around, are we moving? Are we moving coherently? Is the pace and scale appropriate? Is it in pace with what's happening in the rest of the world, insofar as we participate in global value chains? I'll go through some of the things that are happening. Certainly South Africa's on the move. At the moment, I would say that green hydrogen developments are outpacing those for electric vehicles. There is the debate that's going on as to whether we need to go the electric vehicle route. Could we not go straight to green hydrogen, for example? But there are developments, and I think also some big answers that we need to still come to as a South African country that needs to combine, integrate, synthesize its energy policy, which includes transport, with its industrialization policy. That's clear. And we've just heard some stories in that regard. So from a green hydrogen perspective, South Africa's made, I think, quite a few inroads into trying to position ourselves to be a player. And we certainly, there are many players that in the South African environment that think that we need to move fast if we're going to play at all, because it's a globally competitive space. But we do have a hydrogen and fuel cell technology research and development and innovation strategy that's known as SA strategy. We've got a hydrogen society roadmap that was developed by Science and Technology. We've got a supportive renewable energy procurement program, and renewable energy is a significant component of green hydrogen development. We've got international partnerships that are evolving for financing green hydrogen. So, for example, the South African Green Hydrogen 18 billion rand fund was launched in June this year. And that's a partnership between the Dutch government, Sanlam in South Africa. We also have the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which incorporates green hydrogen and is a partnership of various international donors. And then South Africa is doing some, useful things like looking at developing hydrogen corridors, making industrial development zone investments, for example, in Kgosientsho and Saldanha, to facilitate transportation and distribution of green hydrogen. And there are some efforts in partnership with international partners to develop South Africa's skills and capacity in that regard. The electric vehicles, as I said earlier, in my view, those developments are a little bit further behind. So we do not have clear policy and incentives in place yet for electric vehicles. The Minister of Trade and Industry announced recently that we would have this by the 31st of March next year. So we're still uncertain about what that's going to look like. But that announcement that we would have that policy by March next year was in response to calls from the industry to invest in electric vehicles for government to support the development and incentivize it because it needs help with the transition. But from both a green hydrogen electric vehicle, whichever route we go, and maybe we go both, the focus is on public transport electrification, and there are already some cities looking at green electric buses, for example. Heavy industry transportation, for example, in the mining industry, is a serious consideration for the big mining players like Anglo American that are very interested and have done some green hydrogen feasibility studies in that regard. And then there's the passenger vehicle market that I spoke about. We're fortunate in South Africa in that because we have such a vast renewable energy endowment, the international community is interested in investing here in infrastructure, for example, port storage, electric vehicle networks, the IDZ developments that I spoke about earlier, as well as skills and capacity development. Are we moving fast enough? I think it's a difficult question. I mean, I know I posed it. It's a difficult question to answer in the context of that need for a balanced conversation that the minister spoke about, and the need for coherent planning, and also just considering international developments and the pace that those are taking. So I recently was in Europe, in Brussels and Holland, the Netherlands, for green hydrogen and green energy conversations and dialogue. And it's very clear that, the European market, for example, is still very interested in green hydrogen, but they're starting to feel that it perhaps isn't going to be as big as they previously thought. And it's certainly not moving at a rapid pace. So it's early 2030s before we're going to see pricing, for example, for green hydrogen at a manageable level. And so it brings back the question of, do we need to move quicker on electric vehicles? And these answers haven't yet been arrived at. And I don't think we've yet considered fully the implications for the just transition and how we're going to reskill those thousands, tens of thousands of jobs to be able to participate effectively. And then we have to balance that question as my last point around the reskilling with what happens if we do nothing or move too slowly, and that those jobs stand to be lost to a great extent in any event. Thank you, Dhlamini.
Thank you so much, Belynda. As a final closing statement, perhaps from you, Fezile, there's a question from the audience as well as one from myself. We have Mr. Clark from Wits University, and he asked that, do you have a plan for charging networks infrastructure within South Africa, seeing that you are an OEM in the electric vehicle space, as well as one from myself. It's really about what you would recommend policymakers and relevant stakeholders implement to induce the support necessary for small businesses. What would you like to see? Furthermore, what advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs who want to participate in this transition? Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dhlamini. I think before I get into the questions, I just want to touch on just a few critical things that I think we've overlooked, which is something called greenwashing. So greenwashing has been a thing that's been that's been happening for the longest of time, especially when it comes to energy transition. And it happens because it's just like at the time when, the first electric vehicle was created in the 1830s, and that transition from electric mobility to fossil fuel, it happened in such a way that it was just more profitable to go and, dig up the oil and, make this never-ending cycle of profit. So at the current moment, however, greenwashing has happened in a way where obviously certain people prefer certain energies and certain components and instruments because of how they favor them economically. And I just want to touch on one point, especially about hydrogen, for example, which for me I feel like it's a moving Oppenheimer bomb. Is that you've got France that recently rejected they had ordered 51 buses from a company which were all hydrogen fuel cell, and then when they made that order, they only realized late after spending 18 million euros that, wait, hold on a second, this doesn't make sense for us, because when you work out your P&L, especially within your OPEX side of things, they realize that if we go with the hydrogen buses, we'll spend about 3 million euros to maintain these assets, which is operational maintenance costs, includes servicing, includes all other infrastructure needs that are there. Versus with an electric vehicle, when they did their P&L, they realized that we'll only spend about 500,000 euros annually. So on the one side, you're spending about 95 euro cents per kilometer, and the other side, you're spending about 15 euro cents per kilometer. So what is not really being communicated throughout this entire journey and transition from your fossil fuel to your EV or your LPG or CNG gas-driven vehicles is the actual costs of that, because we only look at it from a primary perspective. We don't look at the secondary and the tertiary. Further on, touching on charging stations, we also need to understand that charging stations are going to happen with or without. But even the way that they've been happening in South Africa, they've been happening in such a way that a lot of policies is not being followed accordingly, and especially when one gets to read and engage with SANRIL. So a lot of charging stations are just popping up. There's no regulations within that space, and it's like perfect positioning. We are the experts, but realistically, long term, it's gonna come back and bite them from a policy perspective. So, do we have plans on our side to actually erect a whole charging network throughout the 22,000 stretch of road that we have in South Africa. Is that yes? I mean, we've had these plans since 2015, obviously consistently re-engineered the entire model. We've had like first-hand experience rolling out electric vehicles in the township, in peri-urban environments, as well as urban environments. So we've created a nice plan for how this thing can function. However, something like that will, and unfortunately, what our government does not realize is that all other OEMs, all other automotive companies around the world, VW, Ford, General Motors, BMW, and all those other guys, they were built off of government funds. You know, though they were supported from get-go, well, not really get-go, but get-go-ish in a way, by the government to be able to expand and increase their enterprise value over the years. So if we don't find ourselves participating in this particular economy right now, that being the value chain of electric vehicle manufacturing, batteries, powertrains, hub motors, motor controllers, and the like, we are going to be left behind. So the same way we were left behind by the gold rush as South Africans, majority of the population, we will be left behind again within this particular space. So, you know, I really do hope at some point that the South African government does wake up and they do realize that they have to intentionally participate. And also they need to now deal with another underlying factor, which is something that people see, but they don't want to deal with it directly, which is competition. You know, it's unfortunate that as South African OEMs, product manufacturers, R&D, we cannot compete with the Chinese. I mean, even if I come with a product at 1,000 Rand, a Chinese can say, I'm going to sell it for 500. And I'll say, I'll sell it for 250. And they'll say, I'll sell it for 100. And obviously I can't go any lower because I'm going to make nothing. I'll just be making a huge loss. And on their side is the Chinese companies. They are supported by the Chinese government. They get the most incentives and the best incentives for exporting their products. For example, the solar panels. That's why we have such a huge influx of Chinese manufactured solar panels, as opposed to the local ones that are being assembled going into the market, which are also more expensive. Now, with the last part of the question, which was my recommendations, you know, for proactive public policy. I mean, number one, the policy has to be proactive. You know, we say a lot, we don't execute a lot. We say a lot, but even the people that are implementing those policies don't even understand half the things that they're trying to do. And a lot of times they're trying to localize all these foreign concepts into South Africa, and not understanding thoroughly the socioeconomic landscape that we're dealing with. Right. So we all want to go ahead and, you know, copy what the West is doing, but not understanding how it actually impacts our local society. So for any like you know, entrepreneurs trying to get into the space, I mean, look, good luck. I mean, just because certain things that never worked out for me in South Africa doesn't mean that won't work out for the next person. But building from scratch in South Africa is something that's not conducive. Look to other countries, especially in Europe, that are willing to take in highly skilled individuals who have amazing R&D concepts that can be exported back to Africa. Look into that and try work on as many cooperative partnerships as possible to be able to build a sustainable business for yourself and for your stakeholders or shareholders. That's about it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I'd like to then bring Sam in to just wrap up the session.
Thank you so much, Dhlamini. So I would like to extend our appreciation from 67 CEOs Foundation and the Just Transition Africa to our speaker, Fezile. Thank you so much for all that you shared. And we hope that by the time your engagement or promised meeting with the minister, Dr. Ramokgopa, happens, that it should almost or somewhat contribute to you staying in South Africa and we seeing your product and your business, you know, thriving in the Republic and across the continent. And so, Ms. Belynda, thank you so much. This is your second year attending our conference, and we're very grateful for your generosity and for always, sharing data and opportunities that are going to support the small business and at large the people that are attending. So once again, thank you so very much, and we wish you all the best.